Good morning and welcome to this How to Integrate Curriculum and Financial Planning webinar. This is one of a series of 6 entirely free short sessions that Entrust Support Services have developed in partnership with the DfE around the key areas of school resource management. Further information on the other webinars in the series is at the end of this presentation, as well as on our website, which is on the screen now. Details of last year's presentations can be found here too. We have also produced a resource pack that will go alongside this webinar. The resource pack contains full instructions for the various websites we'll be looking at throughout the presentation, so there is no need for anyone to take copious notes. Included in the pack will be some frequently asked questions you can refer back to, along with some useful internet links to the various sites and tools we'll be looking at today. Also in the resource pack is a helpful calculation guide on how to calculate the ICFP metrics we will be looking at today. Some of you may have already downloaded our resource pack, but if not, it is available on the website. Let's have a look at our learning outcomes. We are going to start by having an overview of ICFP and look at some of the tools that the DfE has available for schools. We will then move on to the metrics and looking at how to calculate them. As you'll see throughout this session, calculating the metrics is only the first step. We then need to analyse them and understand how to report them. Finally, we will look at implementing changes based on ICFP, and I will provide further guidance on the other resources available to you. We're going to start with a quick introduction to ICFP. Integrated Curriculum Financial Planning, or ICFP, is a data-driven approach which enables schools to plan the best curriculum for their pupils at the school with the funding that they have available. It's designed to bring senior leaders together to manage risk and maximise opportunities for pupils. It is a key management process that the DfE expects schools and trusts to use to inform decisions as part of financial and workforce planning. This expectation is set out in the school's financial value standard for maintained schools and the school's resource management self-assessment checklist for academies. ICFPs does focus on the staffing structure and the process supports decision making around teaching and educational support staff deployment in schools. It's worth noting that ICFP can be carried out by every phase of school, including primary, secondary, special and also alternative provision schools. There are individual tools for each phase and we will be looking at them a little later. When an ICFP exercise is carried out, the school receives a set of key financial and curriculum metrics. Analysing these results can highlight where schools can create savings to invest elsewhere, which will make the greatest difference to those pupils at school. We will be looking at some of these specific metrics and analysing them later on in the session. There is no one way to start the ICFP process. However, ICFP does involve the analysis of teacher deployment, use of support staff, non-staffing costs and the balance of income and costs. The most common approach to ICFP is displayed on the screen now. At the preparation stage, we need to get the right people involved. This includes and is not limited to trustees, governors, head teachers, school business professionals and the curriculum lead. The ICFP process should be a combined effort which complements each other's skill sets. At this stage, if we don't have one already, we also need to create an educational vision statement for the school and also conduct a thorough assessment of the school's current financial situation and available teaching resources. The next step is the analyse stage. We need to look at the curriculum that the school wishes to provide and link the cost of providing that curriculum to the budget planning. We then need to measure and benchmark those key metrics against other similar schools and analyse the results. As part of the process, we will need to establish common assumptions about what will change over the next 3 to 5 years, including pupil numbers, funding, costs, and staffing or educational policy. This is where working as a team does help, as the school will have experts in each of the different subject areas. Finally, at the planning stage, schools should reconcile their staffing and curriculum plans with what can be delivered in a balanced budget and write a strategic plan for the next 3 to 5 years. As with any project, this should be regularly reviewed and updated as things change. The ICFP process can seem overwhelming at first, but there are plenty of resources available to support you, which we will be looking at later on. Before attempting ICFP process, I recommend preparing the following: personnel information including categories of staff and full-time equivalents of both teaching and non-teaching staff, the school timetable cycle including the number of periods each teacher is teaching, the leadership structure, any TLR costs, and a budget forecast including pupil numbers, projections for the future years. Having all of this information prepared at your fingertips will allow the process to run as smoothly as possible. We mentioned it right at the start and I'll reiterate it again. ICFP is about forward thinking for the next 3 to 5 years. We would therefore need to consider about how any of this information will likely change. This may include increasing or decreasing pupil numbers, a change in the leadership structure, inflation, or potentially a staffing restructure. These considerations should be reflected in the ICFP plan. As previously discussed, ICFP is a tool that helps schools to plan the best curriculum for their pupils with the funding that they have available. However, what are the benefits of linking the curriculum and financial planning? Well, hopefully, once an ICFP exercise is carried out, educational success and financial sustainability at the school should be secured. ICFP also helps to ensure that the school is delivering the best possible education with the resources available and enables planning for future school improvement. ICFP also gives structure to multi-academy trusts as leaders can consider consistency of operation across its schools through the use of relevant ICFP metrics. ICFP will also increase the financial awareness of the school and provide a set of metrics which can then be used for benchmarking and comparison purposes. That's all very positive so far. However, a couple of points to temper any expectations. ICFP is not a magical money tree, and using ICFP will not solve any huge financial difficulties on its own, but it can highlight potential directions for a school to go. ICFP will take up a good amount of planning and implementation time of school leadership staff, especially the first time the process is looked at. However, once it is up and running, hopefully the continuation of the process should take less resources. On the previous slide, we mentioned benchmarking and comparisons. The metrics you receive as part of the ICFP process can be benchmarked against other similar schools on the DFE tools, including the school's financial benchmarking website, View My Financial Insights, and the self-assessment dashboard. I won't be going into them too much in this session as we also have a webinar available on benchmarking as part of this series. But in able to analyse the ICFP results, we will need to benchmark them against similar schools. To help with the process, the DFE has plenty of resources available to schools. Currently, there are 3 ICFP tools available on the DFE's ICFP website. There are separate tools available for primary schools, secondary schools, and the DFE has also produced an individual tool for special schools and providers of alternative provisions. Although there are separate tools for primary and secondary, there are limited differences between the 2 versions. There is also a staff deployment analysis tool which was produced by the Pioneer Academy Trust. This is an ICFP tool which was produced by a group of primary schools. For those on the session today from primary schools, it might be worth having a look at, especially if you are sceptical on how ICFP does work in a primary school setting. Each of the tools are available for free on the DFE's ICFP website, and each tool has an accompanying user guide which I recommend downloading and following as you start to populate the tool. After the completion of the tool, the school will have a set of key metrics and ratios. However, calculating these metrics is only the start of the process. We will need to understand what these ratios are, what they mean, and how to calculate them, and we'll be doing that in this next section. Over the next few slides, we are going to look at some further ICFP resources and some of the key metrics. We will look at how they are calculated and what each metric can tell us about the school. We haven't got time to go through every possible metric. However, hopefully I've picked the ones which are most relevant to you and ones that will give you a good introduction to ICFP. Before we have a look at the specific metrics, I wanted to point out another useful tool available for ICFP. One of them is called the Fundamental Equations Workbook, and there is also a supporting document available to help you through the process. The Fundamental Equations Workbook is also available on the DFE's ICFP website. This resource enables a user to input some very basic financial and curriculum data, and as a result, some ICFP metrics are provided without the user thinking about the calculations too much. This is a good starting point, especially if you are new to ICFP and would like an introduction to the process. The second useful tool available is View My Financial Insights. This is available to both Maintain Schools and Academy Schools. Unlike some other sites such as ICFP and the school's financial benchmark website, you will need a DFE sign-in or IDAMS account to get onto the website. But if you don't have one or aren't sure, there's plenty of guidance on the link displayed on the slide to get you started. There's much more than just ICFP on the View My Financial Insights page, mostly in terms of detailed benchmarking information, but this is covered in much more detail in our benchmarking webinar. For this session, we'll just concentrate on what's available in the Curriculum and Financial Planning tab. What the View My Financial Insights site does is use the information available to the government to make some ICFP calculations, giving you easy access to some of the metrics we'll look at today. Of course, the obvious problem with that is that the DFE doesn't have access to all of your latest data and certainly doesn't have anything for current and future years. It's a decent place to start if you're totally new to ICFP, as it's very quick and doesn't involve anything complex. But for a full ICFP process, you're going to need a system or a tool to help with that. What the View My Financial Insights site does is use the information submitted by schools through the annual accounts return, consistent financial reporting return, pupil census and workforce census returns to make some basic ICFP calculations, giving you easy access to some of the metrics that we'll look at today. For Maintain Schools, this is updated with the latest financial figures and January census data in the autumn term. For instance, 2021 to 22, Maintain School financial figures and January 2022 census data will go live this autumn term. For academies, this is done in the spring. 2021/22 academy financial figures will go live in spring 2023. To accommodate future years, there is functionality to add data manually. The DFE cannot pre-populate this as they do not collect this information. However, there is some additional functionality on the View My Financial Insights site that I wanted to mention. You can enter your own data for current or future years as well as the recent past if required to get a more up-to-date analysis. You'll need the various information listed on the screen now. It's quite simplified and it's worth pointing out that it's not as thorough as your own full ICFP process using a tool, but it is quite handy if you want to see what ICFP is all about and get a taste for it, or if you are really pushed for time. Once you add in some extra data, you'll see a few metrics calculated for you, such as teaching load, average class size, and the pupil to teacher ratio. And further down the page, you'll also see some financial calculations. There are details on what these ratios mean and how to calculate them yourselves in this next section of the webinar. The first metric we will look at is a simple one called average teacher cost. To calculate this one, take your total teaching staff cost and divide it by your teaching staff at full-time equivalent. Total teaching staff costs should include gross pay and allowances, employer national insurance costs and also employer pension costs. The result of this metric will be influenced by what types of teachers you employ and the full-time equivalent number of teachers you have at your school. Once we have a result of this metric, in isolation it does not mean a great deal. We will need to benchmark against similar schools to get some context. If the result is higher or lower than expected, what can be done to resolve this? The answer to this question should be discussed as part of the ICFP process within the leadership team. As an example, if this result is high, does that mean that the school has a lot of teachers on the upper pay scale or perhaps a higher proportion of leadership than average? Looking at the other factor in the calculation, teaching staff at full-time equivalent, does this mean that the school needs to increase the full-time equivalent of its teaching staff, and if so, can they afford to do this? Moreover, if this result is lower than the comparator schools, does this perhaps mean that we have too many full-time equivalent teaching staff, and do we need to look at reducing this? However, from a curriculum point of view, can the school afford to do this? As hopefully we've seen, this exercise is about understanding the data and discussing this to get some context, rather than it being a directive to get your metric down to a numerically acceptable level. The second metric we will look at is the pupil-to-teacher ratio. This is based on the number of pupils compared to the number of teachers employed at the school. This can be done in two ways. One, by looking at what your ratio actually is, and one by looking at what the ratio the school can potentially afford is. We're going to focus on the actual pupil-to-teacher ratio first. This is calculated by taking the school's pupil numbers and dividing this by full-time equivalent number of teaching staff. This will include leadership as well as teaching staff. Again, to get some context, the results will need to be benchmarked against similar schools. If you find that the school's pupil-to-teacher ratio is lower when compared to similar schools, does this mean that the school has lower class sizes than the comparator group, or does this mean the school has a higher proportion of non-teaching leadership staff? Alternatively, if this is higher when compared, does the school have higher class sizes when compared to other similar schools, or less teaching staff, and does the school need to address this? I want to point out a very important point. These metrics can be calculated for past, present, or future years. For example, if the school was scenario planning, the figures can be recalculated to see the effects certain scenarios may have on the ratio, and as school leaders you can start to address any issues before they arise. The third metric we will look at is the affordable pupil-to-teacher ratio. This is the number of full-time equivalent teachers that the school can afford. This can be compared to the actual pupil-to-teacher ratio. In the DFE ICFP tools, this metric is calculated by taking the amount of revenue available for teaching costs and dividing this by the average teacher cost, which we calculated earlier. If the affordable pupil-to-teacher ratio is lower than the actual pupil-to-teacher ratio, it may be a sign that the school is heading into financial difficulty and that the curriculum is not sustainable. School leaders would then need to discuss how to bring this metric back up to an acceptable level. There are a couple of options available, including increasing the revenue available for teaching costs. However, where do you divert this from? Can the school still operate with reduced expenditure in other areas such as other staffing, premises costs, or even resources? Alternatively, does the school need to consider increasing revenue as a whole, but is this achievable and is this sustainable? There are lots of things to consider when looking into these metrics, including the knock-on effect of pupils, staff, and the wider community, and schools should take great care when making decisions. We're going to take a step away from staffing ratios for the moment and look at average class sizes. Average class size is the traditional name for the pupil-to-teacher ratio as applied to the curriculum group if all pupils are evenly divided by all the teachers teaching on the school timetable. To calculate this one is pupil numbers divided by the total teaching period allocation. As with the others, this figure can be benchmarked against similar schools. A relatively low average class size may indicate that the class is not sustainable and the income received per pupil is lower than the actual cost of providing the class. To increase this metric, schools could consider reducing classes and increasing pupil numbers if possible. However, bigger class sizes may have a detrimental impact on pupil outcomes, and it will be up to the senior leadership team to discuss this one to see if the benefits outweigh the negatives. I do recommend keeping an eye on this one for the future, making use of your pupil number projections, as this could help you make staffing decisions in good time. The next metric we are going to look at is the senior leadership percentage. School leadership structure can vary significantly and it can be quite interesting to compare. A relatively high proportion of the workforce in the leadership group may suggest not enough of the workforce is focused on teaching, and the pupils may benefit by the schools reducing this and directing the extra time to the classroom. However, a relatively low percentage may indicate that more management time is required to ensure that the school is run sufficiently. The teacher contact ratio shows how much of a teacher's time is spent in the classroom teaching. In the DFE's tools, this is calculated as average teaching load divided by timetable cycle. Average teaching load and timetable cycle may be new terms to a few of you on this webinar today. Timetable cycle is the amount of periods which are typically taught in a week. For primary schools, this is typically shown as the value of 10. A session in the morning and a session in the afternoon for 5 days a week. Secondary schools typically show this value as 25 periods, 5 periods a day for 5 days a week. The average teaching load is the amount of those periods actually taught by the teachers. This does include leadership, so any non-teaching heads or deputy heads will reduce this average. For example, if a teacher in a primary school teaches for 4 days and has the other day as PPA and other responsibilities, the average teaching load for this member of staff would be 8, and then I divide this by the timetable cycle of 10 to give me a teacher contact ratio of 0.8 or 80%. But what does this value mean? On its own, it can give you an idea of whether you have too many or too few teaching staff. A typical average value quoted is 78%. This may seem low, but remember, each teacher will have around 10% of PPA time, and your leadership will be included, and some of them will do little or no classroom teaching. 78% is not a target, and your school may be perfectly functional at a different value, but it could be a topic for conversation should you find your own value vary significantly. If your own calculation is below the benchmark, schools would either need to increase teaching periods or reduce the number of teachers. This could indicate that the school has more teachers than it needs and potential savings could be made here. But please bear in mind that the school may have a very good reason for having a contact ratio below the benchmark. It's also worth saying here is that any change to this contact ratio is going to have an impact on workload and work and life balance of staff. If you are worried about this, the ICFP section of the DFE's website has links available to a workload reduction toolkit that contains practical resources for school leaders and teachers to help reduce workload. This toolkit is produced by school leaders, teachers and other sector experts, so may be well worth a look. Next, we are going to look at total teaching staff costs as a percentage of revenue income. To calculate this, we take the total teaching staff costs and divide this by revenue income and multiply by 100 to give a percentage. Total teaching staff costs and total revenue income for each school can be sought from the school's financial benchmarking website, and this means that we can complete this calculation for our comparator schools to see how we compare. When comparing results, if our spend on teaching staff is high, it may mean that other staffing areas are not resourced appropriately or not enough revenue expenditure is incurred in the other areas of the budget. Pupils may not have enough resources, other staffing areas may not be staffed sufficiently, and this could have a knock-on effect on the well-being of staff and the educational outcomes of the pupils. Furthermore, if our metric is quite low then when compared to similar schools, does this mean that there isn't enough teaching resources available? The final metric we are going to look at is the total staff cost as a percentage of revenue income. It's very similar to the previous metric. However, this is calculated as total staff cost divided by revenue income and multiplied by 100 to give a percentage. If this metric is quite high, it could indicate that not enough revenue is available for the rest of the expenditure at the school. It may be an indication that premises, ICT hardware and other priorities are being neglected. Both the total staff cost figure and revenue income figure for each school is available of the school's financial benchmarking website, and you can work this out for your own school and others to see how you compare. To lower this metric, schools would either need to reduce staffing costs or increase revenue income. Alternatively, if schools did wish to increase this metric, as an example, schools could increase staffing hours, appoint new staff, or review TLRs. Hopefully the metrics we have looked at today have given you a taste of ICFP, and you have seen the benefits of carrying out an ICFP exercise. As mentioned, there are lots of metrics to calculate, and within the resource pack of this webinar, we have provided an overview of the most common ones and how to calculate them, including the ones shown on the screen now. We mentioned it right at the start, but to reiterate it again, ICFP is about using this data to create a 3 to 5 year plan. ICFP is also not a one-off exercise. It should become part of your regular planning process, and the data which drives ICFP should be updated as and when things change. This includes, but is not limited to, changes in funding, staffing structure, pupil numbers, pay scales, and school priorities. ICFP can be a lengthy process, but having a tool which is maintained rather than starting from scratch each time can help the process, and that's my recommendation. Moreover, each of the metrics discussed and the ones demonstrated in the resource pack can be calculated for previous, current and future years. When considering any changes to the curriculum or finances, the metrics can be recalculated using the revised data, and these results can also be benchmarked against similar schools to see how you compare. We've now had an introduction into ICFP, looked at the available tools and also looked at some of the ICFP metrics. The next part of the process is to report on the ICFP results, and we will have a look at that now. Before we look at how to report ICFP results, it's important to discuss who we report the results to. ICFP metrics should be discussed with the leadership team, especially when there is an indication that a value is higher or lower than the standard. It is not enough to just identify the metric. ICFP results need to have context and the reasons discussed as to why the metric is as it is. All of the leadership team should be a part of this discussion. This isn't something for the business manager to do on their own. From experience, I found that the more senior leaders involved in the ICFP process, the greater the results have been. Once you have been through an ICFP process, you've hopefully got yourself a picture of the current and future situation of your school. But of course, circumstances can change, and it's important to not think of ICFP as a one-off exercise. It's an ongoing process which you can revisit whenever you feel necessary. At least annually would be my recommendation. We've mentioned this right at the start, but now we've been through the entire process, hopefully you can see the importance of getting the leadership team involved. A full ICFP process isn't just about finance. You need to input from the curriculum side to be able to competently model the time teachers are spending teaching, managing, and so on. Hopefully ICFP can become integrated as one of your regular planning tools. It won't need to be discussed every meeting, but can be referred to as and when required. We are now going to move on to have a look at implementing change based on ICFP results. Once you have your ICFP metrics and it is clear that you may need to implement change at your school, I recommend that you do so with caution. It's not just about the bottom line. Consideration should be made to both the pupils, staffing and the school as a whole. ICFP metrics will support school leaders in making those tough decisions. Once a change has been implemented, it's imperative to monitor this and to report back on if this is on track to achieve its outcome. There are further resources available to schools, including a HR planning webinar as part of this webinar series. There are also links provided to further ICFP training on the DFE's ICFP website, and also information around workload reduction. Before we conclude the webinar, I want to mention some of the useful guidance available for ICFP. I have displayed these on the screen now, and I've also provided a direct hyperlink to each of these on the slide. The first document, a 7-step guide to integrated curriculum and financial planning, sets out an approach to ICFP which I do recommend following. This is especially useful if you are new to the process. The Basic Principles of Integrated Curriculum and Financial Planning document discusses the basic principles of ICFP, which helps you to prepare before carrying out an ICFP exercise. And finally, the Glossary of Terms. This details some of the common ICFP terms we see throughout the process. This document will ensure school leaders, academy trustees and governors understand these terms we commonly see throughout the ICFP process. Furthermore, there is further financial advice available for schools. This webpage details a list of financial advisors for schools that can support with ICFP should you require this service. This concludes our webinar today. We'll just revisit our learning outcomes. We can see that we've had an overview of ICFP and had a look at the ICFP tools available from the DFE. We've also had a look at some of the metrics and looked at how to calculate them. Hopefully now we all know how to report ICFP results and feel confident about implementing changes based on ICFP results. I would just like to remind you that you can book onto the other school resource management webinars via the website that is currently shown on this slide.